Many only know Pakistan as their home. They were born there, but Afghan refugees now face being kicked out, sent back to a country still riven by war. Can Afghanistan cope, and is Pakistan's decision purely political? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. More than 2 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan are now living in uncertainty as a deadline for them to leave the country expired on Saturday. The government in Islamabad announced last year that all Afghan refugees must return to their homeland. Their proof of registration cards have been extended a number of times, but the government says eventually they will all have to leave. For many of these refugees, Pakistan is and always has been home. Afghan families first began seeking asylum in Pakistan in 1979 when war broke out, so many of them were born and raised there. They also say conditions are not safe in Afghanistan for them to return. But the Pakistani government says its economy cannot afford what it calls the burden of the refugees any longer. Kamal Haider has more from the capital, Islamabad.
Ever since the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in late 1970s, the Afghan refugees have called Pakistan their home. The government of Pakistan has been exerting pressure on these refugees to go back because they say that these camps are used as sanctuaries by militant outfits which are targeting Pakistan. However, as the relationship between Kabul and Islamabad has become better after several rounds of talks between the civil and military leadership, Pakistan is more careful as far as dealing with the Afghan refugees is concerned. The country is also due to hold an election on the 25th of July, after which a new government will be in place in Islamabad to take key decisions on the future relationship with Afghanistan and the plight of the Afghan refugees residing in this country. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees is optimistic that despite the fact that 30th was indeed the deadline, the government of Pakistan was likely to increase that deadline till the end of the year and to ease the suffering of the Afghan refugees residing across this country. This is Kamal Haider reporting for Inside Story from Islamabad.
Well, almost 1.4 million registered Afghan refugees were living in Pakistan at the beginning of this year. The UN's refugee agency estimates up to 1 million unregistered refugees were also there. Since then, only 21,000, that's fewer than 1%, have returned to Afghanistan. That's according to the UN's humanitarian office. Around 150,000 left last year when Pakistan first announced its repatriation plans, but fewer than half were registered refugees helped by the UNHCR. The others either went back of their own accord or were deported by Pakistan. Well, let's bring in our guest now. Joining us from Kabul is Riaz Sadat, a former Afghan refugee in Pakistan who returned to Afghanistan in 2003. Here in Doha, Naveed Ahmed, an investigative journalist from Pakistan. And also from Kabul is William Carter, head of Afghanistan program at the Norwegian Refugee Council. A very warm welcome to all of you. Mr. Sadat, let me start with you. Should the deadline for Afghan refugees to leave Pakistan be extended once again? What is at stake here for them?
Thank you very much for having me here. I believe it should be extended. There is a need for extension, and the government of Pakistan shouldn't be using the refugees as a political pressure at the moment. Afghan government doesn't have that capacity at the moment to absorb those huge number of refugees. And the government of Afghanistan can prioritize different categories of refugees which can be absorbed. For example, those who have some established businesses or those who have relatives and family members abroad. But those who are living with very limited means in Pakistan will be very difficult for them to absorb and to adjust to the environment of Afghanistan. So the government of Pakistan should comply to the non-refoulement principle and extend this deadline.
Mr. Ahmed, why, after hosting Afghan refugees for nearly 40 decades, has Pakistan started repatriating them and made such a priority of it in the last 2 years? Why at this time?
Well, the answer is very clear. Since Hamid Karzai government and the following government, Afghanistan has been it has been ruled by its own people, and there has been no plan as such as to how the refugees are going to go back. There is no public pressure as such on the Afghan refugees to be returned, to be repatriated. There is a sympathy, there is that brotherhood that was there in 1979 to a great degree. But when there are incidents of terrorism and somehow Afghan refugees are found involved in them or in political protests like Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, the recent political upsurge, then it raises some concerns. More so because of economic reasons, as Kamal reported from Islamabad, that Islamabad has been under stress from various, for various reasons, internal issues, corruption, mismanagement, and now this FATF. All of them snowball and create a scenario for Islamabad to seek a plan from Afghanistan for repatriation. And understanding generally is that Afghanistan is not serious about taking the responsibility of the refugees as much as the refugees want to stay, and Pakistan understands their vulnerability, and the same feeling of ownership is not there in Kabul.
Mr. William Carter, do you think Afghanistan is in a position to take these refugees back, given the number of violent attacks and the instability that continues in the country? I mean, just last year, 3,538 people were killed in attacks, more than 7,000 injured.
Yes, we would agree that now would not be the best time for people to be encouraged to return back to Afghanistan. Security incidents have gone up, control over parts of the country has really gone down, and the situation is very, very fragile and uncertain with the elections coming. We saw a large wave of people, of refugees, feeling forced to return in 2016 from Pakistan to eastern Afghanistan. It's a very tenuous position. Nangarhar province on the border with Pakistan has seen the Islamic State-aligned groups fight with the Taliban, fight with the government and international military forces. It's a province where the mother of all bombs was dropped last year, a province where just a few months ago our colleagues that Save the Children in eastern Afghanistan were unfortunately attacked. It's really an unsafe situation right now. We'd also say that in our own studies and research, which we'd released earlier in this year, in January, pointed out that of those the hundreds and thousands of people that had come back in 2016, many of them had been forced to flee again or leave their homes because of insecurity or because they hadn't found basic services available to them. So really, there's not a solution here just yet. We really hope that the government of Pakistan remains patient, that the international community can support refugees staying in Pakistan who have been very, on the whole, generous host over 4 decades of hosting Afghan refugees. But now really is not the right time for people to feel forced or encouraged to come back.
Mr. Naveed Ahmed, what do you make of that? Because, you are citing the security and economic reasons that Pakistan is considering in sending these refugees back. But as Mr. Carter has been saying, there is a real security problem where there is a lack of it in Afghanistan. So how high is that a factor in the Pakistan government's consideration here?
Well, that's a very valid point. The insecurity in Afghanistan has risen, and this is a sign that the government in Kabul is not effective, and which raises the concern in Islamabad as to how would these refugees eventually go back if Kabul keeps losing control and militants, whether they are Daesh or Taliban or other factions, they continue to gain more space and they operate in larger areas than they were like 5 years ago or 2 years ago. That concern very much exists. What is more important is the commitment that Kabul shows or lacks to show on the table and in its plans. As my friend Sadat said in Kabul, that there should be a priority, there should be a serious discussion about how in phased manner all these refugees can go. There is little progress on that account, and Islamabad feels that this politicization of the issue, which is being said and termed, helps Kabul and Washington and other stakeholders realize that Islamabad is not obliged to continue this hospitality for a very long time. On the other hand, I would just give you a very separate example. There is this movement called Open the Border in southern Syria, Daraa, and Jordan, for Jordan to open the border. But at the same time, Jordan is saying that we need support. For Pakistan, the same has been not there for a long time.
Yeah.
And instead, there is a recent grey list addition of Pakistan in FATF, Financial Action Task Force. All these things cannot coexist, that Pakistan continues to take the responsibility that is due to it on the name of neighborhood and humanity.
Yeah.
But then Washington, which needs Islamabad support, continues to press Islamabad against the wall.
Yeah, so Pakistan, has taken in a great number of Afghan refugees, obviously more than anyone else, and you're saying that it has not received the international support that it needed to do so. Mr. Sadat, let me come back to you, because you were actually an Afghan refugee in Pakistan. So what was your experience of that, but also of returning to Afghanistan? Did you have the support you needed when you returned?
Thank you. Well, I lived in Pakistan as a refugee camp for about 14 years, and I grew up there. I had my primary and secondary schooling there. We lived in a mud house and in a difficult situation, but we thought that how life was. We didn't know how difficult life or situation was there. Now we know we were in difficult, but at that time we thought that was the normal life for everyone. The time we were returning after the fall of Taliban in 2003, we thought in Pakistan that we are taking a very difficult decision, and we are going to a place, especially for me, that I had never been before, to Kabul. So when we came in the beginning, it was a bit difficult to adjust. But soon after, we realized that our parents had taken a very positive decision.
And Mr. Sadat, can I ask, was it a voluntary, so you're saying that your parents, it was their decision then, it was voluntary?
It was a voluntary decision that we left the Kachagari camp in Pakistan, which soon was bulldozed later. But our migration to Pakistan was forced, and but returning was, of course, voluntary at the time. Comparing Afghanistan of 2003 with 2018, it's quite different, and the situation has improved in terms of infrastructure or economy or job in other terms. And at that time, we thought it was, the life was difficult in the beginning or in the few first months. But later on, we were very happy with our decision. And right now, when I look back at the past years that I've lived in Afghanistan and the opportunities that we have grabbed and used, I think we couldn't do that in Pakistan. So there are such opportunities for the refugees and the returnees who are coming back. They're not available in Pakistan for them, but if they come here, they can utilize them and use them for great.
Mr. Carter, how many of the refugees who return have an experience that's similar to Mr. Sadat's, which was positive? Because the UNHCR says that returns have to be voluntary, safe, and dignified. But is that often the case?
For returns to be good and well managed, yes, they do need to be safe, voluntary, and dignified. And every refugee, registered or not in Pakistan, has a right to return out of their own free will, and we would support that along with other agencies. But what it was unclear, or perhaps clear, in 2016 when we saw 600,000 refugees come back very suddenly over the course of 4 or 5 months. Many hadn't been prepared. Many were not very well informed about the conditions that they were returning to. So these are standards which we have to uphold and encourage the government of Pakistan to make sure happens. And it has the voluntary repatriation process is a very sensitive one that needs to be done with enough time for people to make informed decisions. Some of those people who returned many years ago, this was a process which they've been very happy with. But we have to make sure that when tempers run high and patience runs thin, that we can still support refugees to make an informed decision to come back, and ideally to an area where it's safe and where they have access to basic services. But that is the opposite of what I saw and what we saw when we were in eastern Afghanistan 2 years ago. I'd seen thousands of families living in open shelter or no shelter conditions, overcrowding in unfinished buildings. I saw children sleeping in the mud next to livestock, heavily pregnant women feeling suddenly forced to return at this point, some of them giving birth during or in a few days of having returned. There have been instances in the past which we hope are not repeated, in which this was a less than ideal scenario, but we are hopeful that Pakistani cabinet will continue to show its mercy and reprieve for Afghan refugees to stay as long as they need to, particularly whilst hostilities have not ceased in Afghanistan.
Mr. Ahmed, the time and the incidents that Mr. Carter is talking about 2 years ago was when tensions and tempers were running high following deadly attacks in Pakistan. And both you and Mr. Sadat have spoken about how Afghan refugees have been used as a political tool between these two countries. How can you make sure that this doesn't happen again?
There is a roadmap. There could be, this is not a new situation. Refugees have been repatriated from various parts of the world, and there is a method to do it. The issue is that how do you categorize it? Is there a roadmap on the Afghanistan's table, and how Afghanistan wants to get it implemented on its side? If Afghan government keeps losing security of its districts, and districts keep falling to Daesh or Taliban every now and then in a month, like 3 to 4, how would that framework be implemented? So the primary question is Afghanistan safe enough for any refugees to come back? And the secondary question is that whether Pakistan is financially strong enough to deal with the presence of so many people who are not paying taxes, who are burdened on resources, who have contributed to economy as well, but not to the extent as they would have had they been citizens and well equipped. So there is a myriad of questions that need to be addressed. It's not just as simple that they are being politicized. There are genuine concerns which emanate from security, economy, and of course humanitarian concern that they will be killed or recruited by Taliban and Daesh once they cross the borderline. So, and above all, how Afghanistan's government reacts towards Pakistan. Is it speaking the language of India, which it has been? How Afghanistan's intelligence agency has been using Afghans on the Pakistani side for political purposes by launching a movement against the military or political parties. There are these delicate issues that need to be understood, and confidence level over the past 6 months or so has really risen. There is a active track through diplomacy going on, and I hope there will be a way out and a framework that could be debated publicly and also within the government.
Mr. Sadat, what do you make of all of those concerns coming from the Pakistani side? Are they being addressed adequately by the government of Afghanistan?
Well, let me make a comment here that first, if we look at the security situation in Afghanistan, it's not ideal, but that does not mean that the returns should stop because of the security situation. If the security situation is so worse, then the people who are currently living in Afghanistan should also go somewhere else. What we are more concerned in Afghanistan about returns is the economic situation and their integration into society here. Security will be the same for all, and we have a hope, and peace will come soon. There is life in Afghanistan, there are businesses, and kind of so much is going on. So security shouldn't be the main or the major reason for them of not returning. There are some other economic problems, and then we should be focusing on that. So the government of Afghanistan, or not only the government of Afghanistan, but all stakeholders in the refugees situation have their own responsibilities, and they have to perform them. starting from Afghanistan, they have to look into different categories of refugees in Afghanistan. For example, those who have established businesses in Pakistan and good lives there, they can come easily in and adjust to Afghanistan's life. They should have a smooth transition for their companies and factories into Afghanistan, or those skilled laborers that we have in Pakistan, the Afghan refugees in Pakistan, they can come to Afghanistan and they can have decent lives in Afghanistan too, or could be exported as skilled laborers to Middle East countries. Apart from that, those Afghans living in Pakistan who have their family members abroad in Western countries or in Middle East can have decent lives in Afghanistan without any problem. Similarly, there are Afghans who are working in Afghanistan, but their families still live in Pakistan. Afghanistan should promote and ask them to bring their families back to Afghanistan. Now, remains the people who are having difficult life living in Pakistan. They have very limited means of life there. Then that's difficult for Afghan government to adjust.
Yeah.
So Afghan government should think about policies, implementing policies for their housing and for their placement in Afghanistan.
Mr. Carter, everything that we've spoken about requires a lot of support and a lot of finance as well. Are international organizations, the international community, doing everything it can to support these millions of people?
In Afghanistan, there is got a well-established humanitarian and development community here, which is working on this issue. But really, it's up to us to support, in this respect, the government to be able to increase the absorptive capacities of service delivery so that health facilities, educational facilities don't get overwhelmed with this, but also some of the longer term issues or aspects that would help people not just come back and survive, but hopefully thrive. So, for example, looking at where people can live and looking at access to jobs. So from this side of the border, the international community is present. It is difficult to work, but we're committed here. We are working with the government to help increase this capacity for a longer term solution. But the government really needs more time.
Yeah.
We need to be more patient with it. It's got elections coming up. It's got, it's trying to rebuild a lot of its state institutions, and there's multiple emergencies internally affecting Afghanistan, such as an emerging drought, such as internal displacement.
We don't have very long left in the programme, and I'd just like to pick up on something that you mentioned, which is a long-term solution, and put that to both of our guests quickly before we end. How do you find a long-term solution? Because these sort of ad hoc extensions and unpredictability, extending their stay for 1 to 3 to 6 months is not sustainable. Mr. Sadat, I'll start with you before going to Mr. Ahmed.
So as Mr. Carter said, of course, the current situation of refugees in Pakistan shouldn't be dealt as an emergency situation. Long-term solutions are very important. And then how do we do that? So as I mentioned before, the categorization of different refugees and returnees, that how do we adjust them easily? Later on, there should be policies and programs, for example, that to train those returnees with a specific job or another skill. Besides that, cash for work.
For that. We don't have very long left, so I will give the last word to Mr. Ahmed here in Doha. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the real issue is the security situation. The political dialogue between Taliban and the government of Afghanistan should be supported by all stakeholders, and that's where the key lies. And once that develops some confidence-building measures, I think Pakistan and Afghanistan can come to the table to discuss a framework and a plan of return or repatriation of refugees.
All right, Mr. Ahmed, thank you very much for that. And thank you to all of our guests. That is Riaz Sadat in Kabul, Naveed Ahmed in Doha, and William Carter also in Kabul. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the whole team here, bye for now.